Welcome back to Fearless. I'm Sissy Graham Lynch. And as I was thinking about how to introduce today's guest, I wasn't even sure. I couldn't even come up with the words because an introduction could never fully convey what God has done through this man. And growing up under the umbrella of Samaritan's Purse, I always understood that the work was never just my dad, Franklin Graham, but it was the incredible men and women God placed around him. Especially when Samaritan's Purse was just a small and growing organization, people came to work because they wanted to serve. And these are people with unassuming and sometimes even unqualified backgrounds, but they were called and they were willing to go. And that is exactly who today's guest is. Ken Isaacs has served faithfully alongside my dad for more than 30 years. And he's run toward the world's most dangerous crisis, war zones, famines, earthquakes, and deadly diseases. If you have seen it on your news, you know Ken is right there in the middle of it, bringing not only physical relief, but the hope of Jesus Christ. And his new book, Running to the Fire, tells that story of how God has used his life in extraordinary ways in some of the most difficult places on earth. Well, Ken, welcome back to Fearless.
Thank you, Sissy. It's great to be with you.
I really do mean that. It was hard to come up with an introduction for you because you can't really convey to the listener of how much you've done and what God has done through your life. If people have read it in the news or seen it at 6 p.m. on the nightly news, Samaritan's Purse, and you're right there on the front lines. And we'll get into that of why it's important to be the first. But this book, as I was telling you, I've been reading it. Running to the Fire is coming out. And I've learned a lot. Somebody I've known my entire life, I learned a lot about you. And so I'm thankful for these stories and telling the next generation of what God can do through faithfulness.
Thank you.
But as I was reading, one thing about growing up, I guess I've never asked about your childhood. I just always assumed you were born and raised in Boone, North Carolina, but you weren't. And you talk about your childhood and how it prepared you for a life of resilience and prepared you for a life on the go. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was born in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. I'm a baby boomer. I'm aging myself. I was born in 1952. So at that time, soldiers were coming back and families were getting started and houses were being built. My mother and dad married, and they were married, 3 or 4 years, and they had me. And my father, my biological father, abandoned my mother when I was 2 years old. I remember it. I have my own mental images of me. Long story short, when I was 6, she remarried a man named Coy Isaacs. And when I was 10, for Father's Day, I started calling him Daddy. And he adopted me around the 10th or 11th year of my life. And so then I was raised as Kenny Isaacs. And my parents were not quite vagabonds. They had a wonderful work ethic, great Christian people. But my mother liked to move a lot. And I can recall sitting around the table at dinner. One time in particular, we lived in Lexington, North Carolina. I was in the 3rd grade. And Mom was talking about a place in Florida called 5 Points outside of Jacksonville. And she had gone there in 1948 with some girlfriends. It was wonderful. I came home from school the next day. The car was packed. And they had a little bunk bed up on top of the back seat for me to sleep. And we took off and we moved to Florida. So out of 12 years of high school, or 12 years of school rather, my parents moved. I was in 4 states and 7 cities and 13 schools. And I never went to the same school for 2 years in a row, except Watauga High School, the 11th and 12th grades. And that is where I met Carolyn. And, we fell in love and got married. But I was always the new kid in school. So I think that helped prepare me for being flexible, for learning how to get along with new folks, how to blend in, how to read people. And, I wondered why had I had such a fragmented life. And, now I see people are moving and, they're contemplating to move and their child's in 4th grade or, my granddaughters, they were in 7th grade and 8th grade and they're going to move. And, it's so traumatic. There was no trauma to it to me. And I think that God used all of that to prepare me to move around the world in and out the way that I do now.
Yeah, I think when my dad was writing a foreword to this book, I remember the word that stuck out, resilience. And from a childhood to the life that God would lead you to, That was a perfect word to describe you, resilient. But I often say when God calls a man, he also calls the wife. And sometimes the wives don't see it that way. They say, okay, you go do the thing. But you have a really unique story of God calling you, but your wife wasn't on the same page at first. Tell the story of Carolyn finally getting on board being called to the mission field.
Well, in 1985, actually it started on Wednesday before Thanksgiving of 1984. And that happened to be the time that I first met your dad. It was at Boone Rentals. But I went into Boone Rentals with my brother to rent a truck. He was moving back to Florida. And the guy inside that owned it, Harris Campbell, said, Ken, I was at church last night and there was some guy there and he was talking about they needed well drillers in some country in Africa. I don't know where it was at, but I thought about you, and if you wanted to go, I'd help you. And I went, okay. Like, I just went there to get a truck. I didn't, prepare for that.
For context of those listening, you drilled wells.
I was a well driller.
In North Carolina.
Yes, I was in a family business, and it was a thriving business, but it was a family business. Well, whatever internal dynamics are going on. So I said, okay. I went on back to the desk where my brother was signing the papers to rent the U-Haul, and I heard the door creak open. And I could hear Harris, the owner, talking. And he said, Franklin, come here. There's somebody I want you to meet. And he brought your dad back there. And he said, Franklin, this is Ken Isaacs. Ken, this is Franklin Graham. And Franklin, I've just been encouraging him to go to Africa. And your dad looked at me with sort of a Cheshire grin,
That's a perfect, Kenny, look at the camera. That's a perfect grin of my dad. You've been on the other end of that look for many years.
And stuck his hand out and he said, well, I think that would be good. Knowing him as I know now, that the posture and his body language and everything was communicating, okay, reservation. And, but God used that, not with your dad so much, but with Harris Campbell, that I did reach out and I made contact with that missionary. His name was Don Norrington. And ironically, as it turned out in 1994, he was the first man that I hired to go overseas with us. But I went to West Africa for a month, and I'd never experienced anything like it. From the time that I got off the airplane, I felt like that I was doing what God had called me to do. And it was just all very natural. The other people that were on the mission team were confused and bewildered and frustrated going through customs and, trying to get their luggage just in the airport. And for me, it was just all an adventure and problem solving. And so anyway, I spent a month there.
Let me ask, how old were you at this time in your
life?
About
34.
Okay.
34. Carol and I had 2 children, and I had 2 boys, same 2 boys I got now, but they're men. And so I got back home, and I was quiet for a few days. And Carolyn said, what's going on? Why are you so quiet? And I told her, I said, Carolyn, I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like God is calling me to the world. The bottom line of it was she cocked her head at me like that. And she said, are you losing your mind? And I said, no, honey, I'm not losing my mind. I'm just telling you, I feel like God's calling me to the world. I'd never heard the word NGO. I had never heard the word relief agency. Samaritan's Purse was just a little embryonic, that new office was just built down there. And at those days, it seemed huge, but it really wasn't that big. And so I didn't know anything, so I prayed. That's all I knew to do was I prayed. And I would search scriptures and pray, God, if you're opening the door, I'll go through it. And I'll trust you. And 16, 17 months, nothing happened. So I stopped praying. I left the family business. I went back to West Africa for a 2-month stint. And in my mind and in my heart, Sissy, that was saying goodbye to that dream that I had been praying for because God didn't open a door. And then in August of 87, I got a call on a Friday afternoon from this man named Preston Parrish. And he said, are you Kenny Isaacs? And I said, yes. He said, are you the well driller? I said, yes. He said, are you Dewey Wright's son-in-law? I said, yes. We had drilled a well at your house. that story's told quite often. And I had given your dad a card there. I left that out in this story. But he said, well, Franklin Graham would like to talk with you about drilling equipment for Ethiopia. Would you come and talk to him? And I did. I went and talked with your dad. I've got a pack of cigarettes, a wad of tobacco in my mouth. I'm a well driller, pretty redneck. And your dad's sitting there, and he gave me this letter that came from Ethiopia that an engineer, Andy Meekins, had written. And it had a list of equipment. And your dad's question was, will this equipment do the job? And I said, well, how deep do the wells go? What diameter are they? I just asked sort of fundamental technical questions. He said, I don't know. We didn't have fax then. We had telex. So, he had Donna Tony, his assistant, type a message, and they had to send it by telex. Went to the engineer, and it was evasive. It didn't answer the questions. And so this went through several cycles. And finally, in around early December of 87, I said, somebody needs to go to Ethiopia and check it out. They need to find a well driller and talk to them. And your dad said, would you do it? I was at that time working in South Carolina, and I would come home on the weekends. So I asked my company, and they said, we would love for you to do it. It's Alabama Gas Company. If we can put it in our newsletter, and we'll pay your salary while you're gone. And I thought, wow, that's very gracious. So in January of 88, I went to Ethiopia. I did a 1-month assessment, came back, gave your dad a list. Here's the stuff you need. Here's what you can expect. It just gave a framework for what the whole program would be. He read it for maybe 2 minutes, Sissy, and he looked up over the top of it. And he said, Kenny, I don't think it's a coincidence that you and I have been brought together. And, in times of struggle in my life and in times of grief in my life, your dad has reminded me of that. He said, do you remember when you brought that paper in? I was reading it, and I told you that it wasn't an accident that we were brought together. He said, don't forget that. Don't forget that. God doesn't do things coincidentally. He doesn't have accidents. It's in his will. So from that point on, your dad immediately goes in for the vulture kill. Will you pray about going? Will you pray about going? You know what I'm talking about.
It means you're going.
Yeah, well,
you're going to pray, but...
Yeah, you're going to pray, but he's pretty tenacious, and he's convincing too. And so, I said, yeah, I'll pray about it. So he'd call me every week down in South Carolina. Are you praying about it? Yeah, I'm praying about it. Well, what's God telling you? I don't know. He hadn't told me anything yet. So he called me back, and I committed to him one call. I will seriously pray about it. Then I started seriously praying about it. I searched the scriptures when God called Moses. Moses had 5 arguments, and I saw the wrath that God had back against Moses, and I feared, if God's calling me, I don't want to say no. And then I also read the book of Jonah, when Jonah was sent to Nineveh, and how ironic it was that in 2012, 2014, 2016, I was in the plains of Nineveh where those things happened. But this day, your dad calls me. It's on a Friday. We had just moved into a new building, and I had a corner office about half as big as your studio right here, about the space that you can see with the cameras. But I had a corner window, and for a well driller, that was top drawer. Like I had never even imagined a corner office. And your dad says, are you praying about this, Kenny? He's coming in with the intents. And I said, yes, I am. He said, what do you think God's calling you to do? And I said, I think God's calling me, but I must be missing the call, the understanding it, because he's not calling my wife. And he said, but you're saying that God is calling you. And I said, yes, I think so. And he said, then what you have to decide is, what are you going to do? Can I pray for you? And he prayed for me 15 or 20 seconds. And in that prayer, I clearly heard, trust me. Mm. And when Franklin said amen, I said, Franklin, I'll be there in 2 weeks. And I stepped outside the door. I told my boss, who cursed me out for 15 minutes. And then he said, well, you better fly home this weekend. What your wife said. I said, I haven't told her yet. He went into another rant. And I did fly home. I told Carolyn, and she didn't talk to me for 3 days. And but God worked in her life worked in my life, and she was an accountant. And probably around, I started on April the 11th, 1988. We had Samaritan's Purse. I counted myself in devotions. I was number 22 person in the room. And Carolyn was like, there's no way I'm going. I'm never going. I'm not going to Africa. Our oldest son was coming out of the 11th grade, going into the senior year of high school, all in one county. And the youngest son was 8, going from the second into the third grade. But finally, in early July, she came home one day and said that she had given her notice. And she was sitting, we were with my mother. And Mama said, oh, well, that's interesting, honey. What are you going to do? And Carolyn said, God's calling me to go with Kenny. I'm going to go to Ethiopia with Kenny. So that was the beginning of it.
Well, anybody that knew her loved her. And she was a strong lady. She had to be strong, the life that God had called her. And I love it because anytime my dad talks about Carolyn, he gets a little twinkle because she was kind of strong towards him too. He brought her in to talk in the office one time. Can you share that?
Yeah. So it was, we're in the period of time where I've committed to going and she hasn't committed yet. And he called me and said, you need to go here to England, you need to go here to Ethiopia, you need to go here to Kenya, and I want you to meet this missionary family down there. And why don't you take Carolyn with you so she can see it? Could God use that to work in her heart? Well, Franklin, you'll need to talk to her. She was pretty bristly on this whole Africa thing. And so I don't remember if I called her, I went home, whatever. And I said, Franklin would like to talk to you. What does he want to talk about? I said, I don't know. Why don't you come and talk to him? So she did. She came and talked to him. And she sat down in the sofa or the chair across from the sofa. You want to talk? And your dad was at a loss for words, which is a rarity. So he laid the travel plan out. He said, I think you would find it very useful, go down to Kenya and meet Jean and Marion Luton, go up to Ethiopia, see the church, come back through London and talk with partners that were involved in the project with us. And she just listened. When he finished, she said, is that all? He said, yeah, that's all. And she got up and walked out. And she just was not warm to the idea. But she did decide to go on the trip. And she went on the trip. And when we left Ethiopia, I had been very sick. I got food poisoning there. When the plane rotated at the end of the runway, in that place where you're feeling the acceleration back in the seat, I leaned over and I said, so from what you've seen, what do you think? She said, well, I think there's a lot of need here, and I think that you can help a lot. But I'm never coming back. Whispered just her nose right on the point of my nose. And, but the Holy Spirit worked in her heart, Sissy. Mm-hmm. And it was nothing but God worked in her heart. And she came home unannounced, said, I've given my notice. Mm-hmm. I'm out in 2 weeks and I'm going to go to Ethiopia. And from that point on, she was full in. From that point on, she was full in with the entire effort. I believe
if God has called a man, he's called the wife and the family because he called you and your boys.
Yeah.
And that's hard. Ministry life, any of us that have been in ministry, it's hard on the family. You've written in your book about when y'all went to Ethiopia, you went together as a family, but your son, Koi, had to go Rift Valley Academy, which is a very well-known missionary boarding school for kids. And that he would write letters, and you said you could see the teardrops on his letters, but it's hard. And I have had to live through that in ministry, in the hardships that can be on a family. But I truly believe, because God's had to deal with my heart over the years, with a dad who was gone all the time, a dad who missed out on things. And that if he's called the husband, the father, he's called the family. And it might look different. He'll equip them in different ways and maybe different times, but he's truly called them.
I would say that's true in my life. It hasn't been without challenges and pain and loneliness and resentment and anger, the whole range of human emotions. But God has blessed each one of my family members in a certain way, gifted them. And their gifts have come out also. But that time that we spent in Ethiopia, the fact that we committed to go, that God worked in our lives that way, changed our lives. And here I am talking to you today, and I've written a book about but it's about what God has done. It's not about what I've done or what we have done as an organization.
One of the common themes I thought through your book, because Ethiopia was just the beginning. You went as a family, but that was just the beginning of a life of service and to go in some of the most dangerous places in the world. But one of the common themes that I saw was God called you, but it might not have been right at that moment. For instance, he called you the mission field, but God didn't answer that prayer. Then a nice job came, a corner office came, then came the offer to go to the mission field, where it was almost harder to let go.
Yeah.
And then you went to go work in Afghanistan, and you thought it was the time to go work. And Dad said, no, not now, Kenny. We're not going to work in Afghanistan. And it was years later after 9/11, then Dad calls you. Okay, Kenny, time to go. Talk to us about God's timing and how God's timing in your life you've had to learn to wait on.
Well, I can be patient, but it's not my strongest attribute. And it's hard to understand what God's intentions are and to know what God's will is. I've noticed with missionary groups, and I'm not being critical in any way, but Samaritan's Purse, we're very prone to action. Something's going on, we're going. And, through that, I've come under the influence of what I call the open door policy. If a door's open, I want to go through it. And as I'm going through across the open threshold, God, if this isn't what you want, please close this door right now. Please close this door right now. So I see God's will frequently exercised through an open door. That means access. It means relationship. It means being able to get on that plane or being able to go. But it's very dynamic. But I've also seen a lot of groups that will sit around and they want to pray for days seeking the Lord's will because they're trying to understand, I guess, God's perfect will, or they need to find comfort in their heart and what God's calling them to do. But I think at Samaritan's Purse, we have much more of a operational ethos of if there's a need, let's go to it right now, because that's what we're called to do. We're called to go to the ditches in life during times of crisis. So that's a little bit how we operate. There's been a few times when I've run to the ditches and then I get pinched some way, or I get caught up in some kind of a situation that is less than optimal, or it might be dangerous or life-threatening. And but I trust the Lord in all of those things, and everything that He's brought me through, everything that He's allowed me to do, I've learned things from it. And more than anything, what I've learned is to trust God.
You've written that you never hid who you were. And I think that's so important. Dad's always said, we're going in the name of Jesus. So many NGOs, and we've used that word NGOs, for those who are listening, non-government organizations, nonprofits that go in, think if they can just get their foot in the door and do good work at first, then we'll tell people about Jesus. But you state right in your book, I think you were in Afghanistan, and you told this warlord who was fighting over territory, look, I'm a Christian. And you don't hide that. And it's very important that in whatever situation you go in, you never hide who you are. Why is that so important as a reminder to Christians to never be ashamed of who you are? Because some people think, oh, you're going to say that to an Afghan warlord?
Yeah.
They're gonna kill you right there. Or send
Well,
you out
I
of the
was
country.
sort of wondering what the outcome of it was going to be. But I'll tell you that your dad taught me something in 1994. It was during Rwanda. We went from the north of Uganda down to the border, and we were staying at the, I think it's called the White Nile Hotel. We had rented like 2 floors of it. We had about 20 people or something. And so your dad and I shared a room that night. It's the only time we've ever shared a room. And 2 little bunk beds as close as me to you. There was no door on the bathroom. And he's sitting on the bed, and he's reading a little Bible that he'd carry with him. And we're getting ready to go down to dinner. And he said, buddy, on occasion he calls me buddy. I don't know why. He says, buddy, he says, tonight I'm going to tell everybody who we are. And I said, well, it's a public restaurant, Franklin. There'll be a lot of people in there. He said, that's okay. I'm going to tell them all. He said, it's important they know who we are. And I was a little uncomfortable with it, like going into a public place. And so we had a long table with all of our team members, and he's sitting at the head of the table, and he stands up. and he projects his voice out to the table. Well, all the lateral sides of the restaurant are heard, but everybody got quiet. Everybody stopped talking in the restaurant. And he gave a gospel message right there, that Jesus came to the world as a human, fully God, fully human, died for our sins so that we could be forgiven for all who accept him and cleansed in God's eyes. He told that whole story. And I'm watching the room, and they were attentive. They were listening. But as time went on, I looked back on my time in Ethiopia. There were a lot of missionaries, businessmen, missionary guys who were coming through. And this was during the Cold War. So a lot of Christians were trying to get over into the communist side of the world and deliver Bibles. And you know, God bless them, that was all great stuff. But what I found living in a communist country, I built a set of credentials where I was qualified as a water engineer with the Ethiopian government. They let me go everywhere. They knew I was a Christian. They knew I was working with Kalahiwa Church. But because I was a good water engineer, because I was a good assessor, they were asking me to go places. And it just made me wonder, why do people say they are who they're not when I'm saying who I am and I'm getting this access? And what I saw with your dad, what he showed me in Uganda in that 1994, in May of 1994, and then we'll jump ahead here to 2001, Afghanistan. I'm going to meet Muhammad Atta, a general. He's got a beard down to here. He's got tanks in his front yard, 400 or 500 men around his house. Now, it's one thing, you've raised around guns. You've got guns on the wall of your house. I have guns around me. We don't have tanks in our yard. It means something. So I go in, and I'm sitting there, I'm talking with this guy, and everybody's sitting around the corner of the walls of the room in these sort of palace chairs. And God had given me a Christian Afghan translator that came out of Rick Warren's church. And so I had Aziz with me. I told the general, I said, we've come to help your people. We can drill wells, we can build schools, we can build hospitals. We want to help. He says, it's good. We need these things. I said, General, there's something I want you to know. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. I'm a Christian. And if that's going to be a problem for you, tell me now, and I'll leave, because I don't want to make any problems for you. And he said, it's not going to be a problem. You're welcome. And I didn't realize that at that time. I learned shortly thereafter, he was extending
protection.
Under his personal protection, he was extending his welcome to me. And in their honor culture, it's a big deal. And but if I hadn't have done that, Sissy, it wouldn't have been the same. They would always wonder, why did you not tell us up front? And so from seeing that in real world practice, I always make a point, not that I'm trying to proselytize people, but I want people to know we're helping in Jesus' name. We are followers of Jesus Christ. If that's going to be a problem, please tell me now. And you know what? We haven't been denied, whether it's in Turkey or Azerbaijan or in Yemen or in Israel or wherever we go in the world. In Sudan, you've been in some of these places. You've been in some of these meetings. People know who we are. Mm-hmm. And I think that even in Myanmar, just in the earthquake that happened earlier this year, no one was allowed in Myanmar. We were able to negotiate to land our planes and bring hospital equipment there. They knew who we were. And I think they respect truth and integrity. And so you've heard me say the quality of our work is a platform. Well, the quality of your work is, do you have integrity? Are you one person all the way around? Or are you going to say, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't want you to know it?
Yeah. Why is our quality of our work so important?
Well, I think that's something that comes out of my well driller background. It was important that if you went and did a job for somebody, you wanted them to call you back. You wanted them to have, you wanted to have legitimacy and authenticity, and you wanted to please them. So when we go to feed people, when we go to drill a well, when we go to set a hospital up, we're doing that in the name of Jesus. We don't want to do that halfway. We don't want to do that with poor quality. We don't want to give somebody nutritional treatment for their starving children and their children continue to starve. We want to be top drawer all the time. And I believe that that kind of approach is the platform of our witness. We are invited into areas around the world that it makes no logical sense that we would be invited in. Why? Because we do a good job. We always do a good job. You know this. And because we do a good job, I like to say that the agencies that work in that humanitarian industrial complex, they hate to love us, but they have to because we do a good job. And they love to hate us because we're followers of Christ, and many people don't agree with that.
You have been to some of the most dangerous and unpredictable situations the world has seen in modern history and on the front lines. But has there ever a moment that you were truly just fearful in that moment, saying, Lord, you got to provide a way?
Yeah, there's been a number of times when I was fearful. You know, courage is simply the persevering through fear. That's what courage is. And but that doesn't mean I don't have fear. But one time when I was totally reliant on the Lord and it wasn't looking good, in 1996, we went to Zaire. We left from Rwanda, took a plane load of medicine over to a missionary that was sort of overran by refugees coming out of Bukavu and Goma. We landed. The airport guy came out screaming at us in French. It's 4:00 in the afternoon. Took our passports and said, that'll be $100 fine each. Like, we don't even know what he's fining us for. I gave him the $300. And he said, go over to Nyankundi, where Dr. Cooper is right now. And he said, come back here in the morning and we'll get this sorted out. But it was unusual. I'd never seen this kind of reaction before. So we go to Nyankundi, and the next morning, we met with the missionaries and the doctors and you know, sort of figured out the plan for the next day to take this medicine down to a place called Kishungu. And there's like 12 guys there at 6:37 in the morning, Army guys. And they're all heavily armed, and they're looking for me, James Isaacs. So that ended up, we were held for about a week. The first day we were interrogated for 11 and a half hours. Dr. Mike Van Royen was with me, and the late Curtis Wilkerson was when Curtis got killed in that DC-3 crash that Brian Stolfus was killed in testing out new engines on a plane that we would have used maybe. They held us, interrogated us, and moved us to a house inside of Bunia in our own airplane. They got gunpoint. We've got them seatbelted in, but they got guns in the plane and say, okay, now fly us and land back in Bunia. So we went there, and it was looking like we were probably going to die. We wrote letters to our wives and made a pact between the three of us that if any one of us got out, we would try to carry the letters back to the loved ones. And their superior officer in a place called Kishungu had been informed that they had 3 Americans with 1 airplane, and there were 600 Army troops coming to where we were. And the Army troops were ruthless to their own people. They would definitely kill us. The one little detail that I missed, even though I had gotten visas from the Zairean embassy, the day that we made the trip over, Rwanda launched war against Zaire, and we came from Rwanda. So they you're spies. You're spies. You're part of the war effort. We didn't even know the war had happened. But we prayed. We drew a lot of strength from the book of Isaiah. In my Bible this day, I have all the marks in there. And I wrote one place, will I live? Will I die tonight or tomorrow? I didn't think we were going to make it out at all. And in the end, God provided a way. We were able to get out. They deported us for illegal entry, which was a sham, but I wasn't going to argue with it. I signed the papers. It took us to the airport. And, just a little side note to that story. I get to the airport, and the chief interrogator, who's a short man, comes sidling over to me. And through all of those hours of interrogation, sitting in a dark room, not allowed to get up, he never spoke a word of English. He spoke in Lingala, and he spoke in French. And then they had a translator. They were very methodical in the way that they would do the interrogation. He walks up to me in fluent English. He says, Mr. Ken, how do you like Zaire? And I said, I love Zaire.
Oh.
And he said, Well, I want to come and visit your country one day. I pulled a business card out. I wrote down every phone number that I could think of. We didn't have mobile phones then. Everybody just, you call one of these numbers and they'll get in touch with me and I'm going to come and take care of everything for you once you get to Charlotte. And this guy had been pretty tough on us. He said, Mr. Ken, I need to ask a favor. And I thought, what a instantaneous power shift where he's commanding what I'm going to do, threatening us, and now he's going to ask me a favor. I said, what's the favor? He said, you see that brown man over there? I said, yeah. He said, he's an Egyptian military advisor. Would you take him out with you? Because he said they'll kill him when they get here. And there was, in fact, a massacre. There were about 2,500 people killed at that airport. And I said, no, it's against policy. I can only take employees. And he said, Mr. Ken, please, he's got 2 daughters. He's got a family. He doesn't need to die here. So I agreed. I took the man. We dropped him off in Uganda at immigration, and we spent the night there. 2018, I'm in Addis Ababa. I'm running for this Director General of IOM campaign, and I'm meeting all of the ambassadors to the African Union, and I go meet the Egyptian ambassador. He says, it's 2018. This thing happened in 1996. He says, Mr. Isaacs, my country owes you a debt of gratitude. Wow. And I said, why? Why do you owe me gratitude? He said, in 1996 in November in Congo and Bunia, he said, there was an Egyptian man and you brought him out, you saved his life. And he said, I want to tell you, his daughters grew up. They had their father. And we owe you a big thanks for saving his life. And that shocked me that their intelligence and all that just washed back in on me really quick. And I broke down and was crying there.
This man knew the family, or?
They had tracked it through their intelligence network, knew who brought him out. And even when I went to Geneva, of course, by this time, I mean, somewhere or another, that intelligence came back up in their diplomatic corps and they thanked me for it. And it meant a lot to me. It was very moving, but it was an unexpected thing in life, it's just how God works. I don't know. I don't know where that went.
I remember flying on an airplane with you one time and just asking you different questions and different situations, things you'd seen. And you had said Rwanda was one of the toughest places you've ever been to after the genocide, that it was a place you wish you never would have to step foot back into. And I believe you've been back since. But tell us about stepping foot in Rwanda that day.
The first time?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the killing started on April the 6th. It was my mother's birthday. That's how I remember.
This was 1994?
April 6, 1994. And some of us went over to see what we could do. We had never been in Rwanda. We hadn't been working in Rwanda. And most of the refugees coming out were down in Tanzania. So a couple of guys went down there and looked at it. And what we didn't fully realize were the refugees that went to Tanzania were associated with the killers that had killed the 800,000 to 1 million people. And a thing that was a real milestone in my life was these other guys had come up with some ideas to go down the road and have a partnership 10 miles away on a small clinic with another Christian NGO. And I didn't like that idea. I wanted to go into, I wanted to run into the fire. I wanted in Rwanda. And there was a bridge over Rusumo Falls, over the river that's there. And we drove up to that bridge, and there was a pile of machetes and different kind of hoes and farming implements that was probably 6 feet high and twice as big as your studio here. And I didn't realize it at the time, but those were killing instruments, and they were taking them from everybody that came across that bridge, little 2-lane bridge. And so I looked on the far side of the river, probably 400 feet, maybe 500 feet over across the bridge. And I saw a couple of guys with red berets on wearing military uniforms, and they were at a guard shack. And I asked the Tanzanian soldier, I said, can I go out on the bridge? And he said, Jeb, you can go halfway. I'll come with you. He spoke English. And so I went to the halfway mark, and I looked up the river, and there were a couple other people with me, and a lot of bodies coming down, a lot of bodies, hundreds of bodies, mutilated and just horrible tragedy, horrible, brutal stuff. And I looked across the bridge and I asked the Tanzanian soldier, I said, I want to go over and talk to those men. He said, you can't go. And I said, listen, my friends are here with you. My truck is over there. I'm going to go over there and talk. He told me again, you can't go. I won't let you. And I just said, I don't think you're going to shoot me. And I turned my back to him and I started walking. And he didn't shoot me. And I went over to those two men and I talked to them using my schoolboy French, which in Africa is pretty decent. I can get along. And I told them that we were prepared to provide general medical care to 10,000 people for 90 days, but we wanted to come inside Rwanda. He said, come back in 2 days. I came back in 2 days, got back across the bridge, and he said, they're waiting for you in Malindi. Well, the only Malindi I knew was down at the coast of Kenya. I knew that wasn't where they were waiting for me. So I had to go get this thing called a map, paper map, of Uganda. And Jim Harrelson and I flew up to Uganda, got in a vehicle. We drove down to the border, and we crossed the border, and we went into Uganda. We got a taxi driver to take us. And I've been in 4 genocides, and they have a common theme. It's as if the insects and the animals don't make sounds, like there's evil over the land. There was no sound at all anywhere in Rwanda during those days. And we went to a shed, a little mud shed, and a lady by the name of Christine Utomi was there, and she went on to become a UN diplomat. Anyway, I did a favor for her. I gave her a couple of aspirin and a bottle of water. She had a headache. And she took us out, showed us some places, and a lady with MSF, Doctors Without Border, Médecins Sans Frontières, waved us down, and she said, the people in my organization will say that they don't need any help, but it's not true. She said, you need to go to Rotary. They need help in Rotary. And I always appreciate that. That lady was from Tunisia, Morocco, and she was very passionate about helping people. So we went to Rotary and we saw about 10,000 people, and we set up starting to help those people. It was a big deal with us organizationally, the way that we did that. But what we didn't know, Sissy, was that in 2 weeks, that population grew to 125,000 people. And those people were fleeing from the south to the north because they were associated more with the Tutsis, and they didn't want to be murdered by the Hutus and that government regime that was doing that. It was a hard place, a hard time staying inside of Rwanda. And we were one of only 3 organizations that stayed in Rwanda while the genocide continued. So we were there for 60 days when the killings were going on. And I think that everybody that was there on our team, and I'm sure other teams died a little bit while they were there, and there was dying and surviving. But we also saw and heard and learned amazing stories of survival, amazing stories of God's grace, amazing stories of reconciliation and forgiveness. You think of Alex that works with us, and he's just one of many. But it was a hard place, and it was at that time it was very, very dark.
You've witnessed humanity at the darkest, evil in the most purest of form. How do you reconcile the evil you've seen with the goodness of God?
To me, it's a great question, and it's not always easy to do it. Sometimes it's not reconcilable. But I realize the fallen nature of man, and there's no bottom where we won't go. If we don't have God as a rudder, we have nothing to repent from. And man's pursuit and ambition of power and greed and revenge and bloodlust knows no end. It knows no end. And, I marvel at soldiers that can go and fight in war and kill people, and they can compartmentalize that in their mind. It's not the way I'd live my life now, and go back and return. But in less disciplined forces, and they can't go back. They can't come back. It's what they know. And God shows himself even in the darkest times. And there's always the question, well, why does a good God allow things like that to happen? I don't know. I heard your grandfather say on Larry King many years ago, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God. And I think that's where I've categorized those kind of questions. Like, I don't know why those things happen. But what I do know, evil is palpable. You can feel it. You can sense it. You can smell it. It's real. And when it happens, I don't want to be where the evil is. I want to move towards the light. And I believe the light, whatever elements of goodness are in the world, that light comes from Jesus Christ. That's my belief.
What do you mean in your book when you say, go even when there is no road?
So that was a metaphor that I created. I make these little witticisms, but in probably around February or March of 1989, I needed a generator that was, I needed to get a drilling machine in Djibouti. And so I went to Djibouti with Desta Dimasi, and there was no system to drive across the road. In fact, they told me that no one had driven through that desert for 11 years, nobody. And so I started a procedure of going to all of the government offices, huge bureaucracy in Ethiopia, particularly under communist government. I said, if I could get like the Ministry of Customs to agree, would you agree to allow me to drive a truck in and bring it in Ethiopia? And so I started that with like 50 or 70 offices. This is a long deal. But it was based off of the presumed no objection of the other players. Then I got to Djibouti. I did the same thing there. And I compiled a thick notebook of everybody's letters of no objections. And we drove out. We're going to drive back to Ethiopia. And, there's no mobile phones, no gas stations. It's tough. And 2 war zones going on. We had to get coordinated with the fighters to make sure that we were going to get passage. And we drove to the gate in a place called Galafi. And there was a gate there, a big wide gate. And when I got to the gate, I was surprised. The guard just threw the gate open. He didn't even look at our paperwork. And we had gone through all this paperwork. And we drove through the gate, and there was nothing. It was the desert. You're driving just like in the desert. It's the Danakil Desert, one of the lowest and hottest areas in the world. And using a compass, I just kept dead reckoning to drive to the northwest. And I was told the map showed if you keep going far enough, you'll come to an asphalt road. And when you do, turn left. And that's what I did. So I came up that it would have been easy to have said, I can't make it because there's no road. I'll tell you something else, if I may. When I went to do that assessment for your dad, it was the last few days of December of 1987. I'm in South Carolina. It doesn't snow there much. There's 6 inches of snow on the interstate going to Atlanta.
Everything shut down, I'm assuming.
Everything shut down. And I talked to Preston Parrish on the phone. I said, Preston, the roads are closed down. I said, if I get to Atlanta, I had a 4-wheel drive. I said, if I get to Atlanta, the airports are closed. And he said, well, Kenny, I think Atlanta's a whole lot closer to Addis Ababa than Jackson is. And, I took him, and I learned through that, just go. Like, if you don't go, you're absolutely not going to get there. But if you go, you can try to resolve issues. So, we went through the desert, and I believe go, even when there's no way to go to get there. If God's opened that door, I believe in going and try it.
I wanted to read something you had written. It goes back to the subject of evil. It says, in so many places around the world, I've witnessed wolves horribly ravaging lambs. And I certainly understand what it feels like to walk into a room, such as in the home of an Afghan warlord, knowing I'm being sent in as a lamb. But that's exactly when I have been able to experience the triumph of the Lion of Judah, who is forever worthy.
The war's not ours.
What would you want people to remember, that we keep our eyes on the lion that does hold victory? And you've seen evil, you've seen the wolves ravaging lambs, women and children, you've seen in the crosshairs of greed and war. What would you want people from reading this book to remember about the God we serve?
You can trust him. Always. You can trust him. Not everyone's going to be called to go do the things that I've done, the things that Samaritan's Purse does. But we all have challenges in our life. Take that job, move over here, whatever. Trust God. God will provide, and he's never let me down. And even in the times in the valley of the shadow of death, he fulfilled his promise. I'll be with you. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. He's always been there. Trust him. He's worthy. That's what I would want him to carry away.
Well, Kenny, thank you. You asked me if I've enjoyed the book, and I said even more than I expected. Because I've had a front row seat to see it. And I get a front row seat to see God's goodness and the miracles. And as you talked about, his righteousness, even in the midst of evil. That's kind of a privilege we have at Samaritan's Purse that not the world gets to see.
Yeah.
But I'm thankful that you've gotten to read it, because anybody that wants to go and serve the Lord, they need to read this first.
Well, thank you.
Because life of service to the Lord is difficult. It's hard, but he's good and he's faithful. And you see that through that. And as Dad has always said, we are to run to the fire. It's important. I do want to ask you, why is it so important that Samaritan's Purse is first? That's one of our goals, is to be the first in, the first on the lines. Why is that important?
A part of the witness is not being first, but it's showing that you cared the most. When you look at Luke 10, and where the parable of the Good Samaritan comes out, 2 religious men of the day walked around that guy. He was in the ditch, bleeding, naked, left for dead. They walked around him. The Samaritan, the social outcast, he went to him. He was the first one that went to him. That man who was rescued that day will always remember for his life. He remembered that guy that took me out of the ditch. And I don't ever want to see us, and I never want to be that guy that went to the other side of the road to stay away from having to get engaged. I don't want to do that. And I don't want to be that. I would fear God for doing that. So, we want to treat people like we want to be treated. A little bit of golden rule in there. Love the Lord God with all your heart, your mind, your soul. Love your neighbors yourself. Would you go pick yourself up out of the ditch? Yeah. Your dad has this saying, we want to put our nose in the middle of things that are going on in the world and do it in Jesus' name. And I like that. Your dad and I get along pretty good, and I like some of his sayings, and I take some of his and he takes some of mine, but that's all right. God has used us.
Have you ever thought what your life might be like if you and Dad didn't cross paths?
No. I never was sure what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I'm still not exactly sure.
Well, Kenny, thank you. And as I said, anybody that's wanting to go serve the Lord, they need to read this book. And it's always important that we run to the fire and not wait. And you've set that by example and not just your words.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today, Sissy.
Thank you for joining Ken and I on today's episode of Fearless. And I just encourage you to check out his book. You can get it on Amazon, where we can get everything, which is great. But I would just encourage you to do this, because if God is calling you to some of the hardest places, whether that's your home, your neighborhood, or halfway across the world, we're to go. And we are to be obedient in that. And we are to run to the fire. And you'll be inspired and encouraged with this book.